The laughter from the first-class deck always cut deeper than the freezing river wind. Emma squeezed her eyes shut and pulled her thin wool shawl tighter around her broad shoulders. "Careful there, girl," a man in a silk top hat sneered, nudging his companion. "Your heavy steps are going to tilt the whole damn steamboat into the mud." His wife giggled into her lace handkerchief, staring pointedly at Emma's wide hips and thick waist. Emma kept her eyes glued to the wooden deck boards, her face burning hot with familiar shame. She was used to the whispers, the cruel smirks, and the way people in town treated her large body like an eyesore. To them, a plus-size woman belonged in the dark corners of the laundry room, not walking where wealthy passengers breathed. Just 20 feet away, a powerful-looking rancher in a tailored leather coat was talking to the ship's captain. His name was Garrett Vance, a man whose massive cattle empire made him a legend across 3 territories. Holding his hand was his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, who was laughing and watching the riverbirds fly by. Emma smiled softly at the little girl, feeling a momentary escape from the cruel stares of the crowd. Then, the world tore apart. A deafening roar ripped through the center of the luxury steamboat as the main boiler exploded. The wooden deck buckled upward, shattering into thousands of deadly, jagged splinters. Thick black smoke and scalding steam instantly blinded the screaming, panicked crowd. The wealthy passengers forgot their manners, shoving and trampling each other to reach the few lifeboats. Emma was knocked hard against the iron railing, the breath bursting from her lungs. Through the thick smoke, she heard a sharp, terrifying splash right below her. Garrett Vance screamed out in absolute agony, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. He was trapped on the upper deck, a heavy wooden beam pinning his leg to the burning floorboards. "Lily!" Garrett roared, bleeding and desperate, stretching his arms toward the churning water below. "My baby! Someone save her!" Emma looked over the edge and saw the little girl's bright yellow dress disappearing beneath the muddy, rushing current. The current was brutal, and the freezing water was filled with sharp, floating debris. The wealthy men who had been laughing a minute ago scrambled past, ignoring the drowning child to save their own skin. Emma did not hesitate for a single second. She climbed onto the wooden railing, her large frame steadying against the heavy wind. With a deep breath, she leaped off the side of the burning ship and plunged into the dark, icy depths of the river. Before we reveal the shocking words Garrett whispered that changed her life forever, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The icy water hit Emma like a wall of solid iron, knocking the air right out of her lungs. The heavy, wet fabric of her maid's uniform instantly wrapped around her legs like a trap, trying to drag her down into the darkness. Any ordinary woman would have panicked, but Emma's life had built a different kind of strength inside her. Years of carrying heavy washtubs, lifting iron stoves, and working until her muscles burned had given her a body made for survival. She kicked her thick legs hard against the brutal current, her powerful arms cutting through the freezing foam. She rose to the surface, gasping for breath, her eyes instantly scanning the churning, debris-filled water. A flash of bright yellow fabric caught her eye just 10 feet away, sinking fast beneath the muddy waves. Emma threw her weight forward, swimming with a fierce, unstoppable desperation that ignored the numbing cold in her bones. She reached out and caught the collar of Lily's dress just as the little girl vanished completely beneath the surface. Emma pulled the small, limp body close to her chest, locking one arm tightly around the child while using her other arm to fight the river. The weight of the water log-jammed around them, and a heavy wooden plank from the shattered deck slammed hard into Emma's shoulder. Pain flared through her back, but she only gripped the little girl tighter, using her own full figure as a shield against the floating wreckage. She looked back toward the burning steamboat, which was now a distant nightmare of orange flames and screaming silhouettes. There was no help coming from the survival boats. The wealthy passengers were rowing away as fast as they could, completely ignoring the maid and the child. Emma's mind flashed bitterly to the cruel townspeople, who had spent years telling her she was too heavy, too clumsy, and worth nothing. Now, that very same weight and physical endurance were the only things keeping a helpless child from a watery grave. The river dragged them down a sharp bend, away from the wreck, swallowing them into the deep, black shadows of the wilderness. Emma kept her head high, her lungs burning and her teeth chattering violently as she swam toward the dark line of the distant shore. Emma's boots finally struck the thick, sucking mud of the riverbank, her legs trembling so violently they barely held her weight. She crawled out of the lapping water on her hands and knees, dragging Lily's small body completely onto the dry earth. The little girl was pale and completely still, her chest not moving beneath the soaked yellow dress. Emma didn't waste a second, pressing her thick, strong hands against the child's ribs and pumping with a steady, desperate rhythm. "Come on, little one," Emma whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed down again. "Breathe. Please, breathe." Lily suddenly gasped, coughing up a violent rush of river water, her tiny hands clutching instantly at Emma's wet apron. Emma let out a ragged sob of relief, scooping the shivering child tightly into her lap and rocking her back and forth. The night was pitch black, and the wilderness around them hummed with the eerie, cold sounds of the frontier forest. Emma knew the freezing night air would kill the girl before morning if she didn't act quickly. She dragged her heavy body up the bank, searching through the dark until she found a small, sheltered hollow beneath a fallen oak tree. Using her bare, bleeding hands, she scrambled around the dirt to gather dry twigs, bark, and dead leaves. She pulled a small brass match case from her deep apron pocket, a waterproof habit she kept from her long days in the laundry rooms. With shaking fingers, she struck a match against a dry stone, guarding the tiny orange flame with her wide palms. The kindling caught, and a small, crackling fire began to cast a warm, dancing glow against the thick trees. Emma stripped off her own heavy, waterlogged wool coat and squeezed the river water out of Lily's soaked garments. She wrapped the little girl inside her dry inner petticoat, then pulled the child tightly against her own lush, warm body. Emma's ample figure, so often the target of cruel jokes in town, acted like a perfect, natural furnace against the freezing night. Lily stopped shivering, burying her face into the soft, comforting curve of Emma's shoulder and falling into a deep sleep. Hours passed in the dark, the fire burning down to glowing embers, while Emma kept a fierce, sleepless watch over the child. Just before dawn, the heavy sound of breaking branches and galloping hooves shattered the silence of the woods. Garrett Vance burst through the thick brush, his face covered in soot, his leg crudely bandaged, and his eyes wild with pure terror. He stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat, as the firelight revealed Emma holding his breathing daughter. The powerful, wealthy rancher dropped his rifle into the dirt and fell strictly to his knees right in the freezing mud. Tears cut clean tracks through the black ash on his face as he looked up at the full-figured maid who had saved his entire world. Garrett remained on his knees for a long moment, his chest heaving as he stared at his daughter's peaceful, breathing form. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken, gravelly whisper that trembled with a raw emotion Emma had never heard from a man of his stature. "You saved her," he breathed, his large hands shaking as he reached out, reverently touching Lily's small, warm cheek. "They told me no one could survive that current. They told me to look for a body." Emma simply nodded, her arms tightening instinctively around the little girl to keep the morning chill from reaching her. "She's safe, Mr. Vance," Emma said softly, her voice steady despite the exhaustion deep in her bones. "She coughed up the water, and she's been warm all night." Garrett looked up from his daughter, his intense, dark eyes locking onto Emma's face with a profound, unblinking respect that made her breath catch. He didn't look at her with the disgust or mock pity she was so used to seeing from the wealthy folks in town. Instead, his gaze was completely filled with awe, recognizing the immense physical strength and courage it took to survive that river. Garrett stood up, wiping the mud from his knees, and immediately stripped off his heavy, fur-lined leather coat. Without a word, he stepped forward and wrapped the massive, warm garment around Emma's broad shoulders, his hands lingering gently on her collarbone. "My carriage is waiting at the main road 2 miles back," Garrett said, his tone turning into one of absolute command. "You are coming to the Vance Ranch, miss." "Emma," she whispered, her face flushing slightly at the unfamiliar warmth of his expensive coat. "Emma Hayes." "Miss Emma," Garrett said, carefully scooping Lily into one arm while offering his other strong arm to Emma. "From this moment on, you will never have to worry about a roof over your head or a cold night again." The journey to the massive Vance estate was a blur of luxury, a smooth-riding black carriage with velvet seats that felt like a different world compared to Emma's cramped maid's quarters. When they finally pulled up to the grand stone mansion, surrounded by thousands of acres of lush green pastures and hundreds of cattle, the ranch hands gathered around in shock. Garrett's traditional stern ranch manager, an old cowboy named Silas, rushed down from the porch with a dark scowl on his weathered face. "Garrett, thank God the little lady is safe," Silas shouted, looking at Lily before his eyes darted to Emma, his expression instantly turning into a judgmental sneer. "But who is this? Why is a river-soaked maid riding in the family carriage?" Silas looked at Emma's large frame, her stained apron, and her wide hips, a familiar look of aristocratic disgust crossing his face. "She doesn't look like she belongs anywhere near the main house, Garrett," Silas muttered loudly enough for the other hands to hear. "The servants' quarters in the back barn are free if she needs a place to sit." Emma felt the old, cold weight of humiliation settle back into her stomach, her eyes dropping to the floorboards of the carriage. Before she could even step down, Garrett's face turned into a mask of pure, terrifying fury, his voice cutting through the courtyard like a whip. "Hold your tongue, Silas, or I will fire you before the sun sets," Garrett roared, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light that made the old manager step back in shock. Garrett stepped out of the carriage first, then turned around, reaching his arms out to personally help Emma down, holding her soft, heavy hand tightly in his own. "This woman risked her life and dove into a freezing river while every coward in a silk hat ran away," Garrett announced, his voice booming so every single ranch hand could hear him. "She is not a servant here, and she will never be treated as one." He looked directly into Emma's eyes, his expression softening into something intensely protective and deep. "Miss Emma is the honored savior of my family," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a low, meaningful tone. "She will stay in the grand guest suite, and she will be treated with the same respect as a queen." He leaned in slightly, his warm breath brushing against her ear as the crowd watched in stunned silence. "I have a question for you, Emma, and I want you to think about it carefully while you rest," Garrett whispered, his dark eyes burning into hers. "Will you let me properly take care of you, or are you going to keep fighting the world all on your own?" Emma lay awake in the massive canopy bed, the silk sheets feeling incredibly smooth against her skin. For the first time in her life, her body didn't ache from scrubbing floors, and her hands were clean and rested. But the peace didn't last long, because the next morning, the outside world came knocking at the ranch gates. A sleek black buggy pulled up to the main house, bearing the logo of the Mississippi Steamboat Company. 2 men in sharp gray suits stepped out, holding leather briefcases and looking around the estate with arrogant smiles. They were the company's lawyers, sent to settle the aftermath of the disaster before the news ruined their stock prices. Garrett met them on the wide front porch, his face carved from cold stone as he stood with his hands resting on his gun belt. "Mr. Vance, we are deeply relieved to see your daughter survived," the lead lawyer said, offering a fake, greasy smile. "We are here to settle the matter of the accident, and also the matter of your maid." Emma stood by the heavy glass window inside, her heart sinking as she listened through the slightly open frame. "What about her?" Garrett asked, his voice low, dangerously quiet like a mountain lion waiting in the brush. "Our records show Emma Hayes was an employee, and her contract states the company is not liable for injuries sustained during transit," the lawyer said, pulling out a crisp piece of paper. "Furthermore, several passengers claim her heavy weight caused a delay during the lifeboat boarding. We are withholding her back wages for negligence." Emma gripped the velvet curtain, tears of pure bitterness stinging her eyes as the old familiar shame threatened to swallow her. They were going to blame her, cheat her out of her hard-earned money, and use her body as an excuse for their own cheap, exploding boilers. Before the lawyer could even finish his sentence, Garrett stepped forward, the heavy thud of his leather boots echoing like thunder on the porch. He snatched the legal paper from the man's hand and tore it into a dozen pieces, letting the white scraps flutter into the dirt. "You listen to me, you miserable city rats," Garrett growled, stepping so close the lawyer had to lean back to breathe. "That woman did the job your entire crew was too cowardly to do, and you will not speak her name with filth on your tongues." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy leather pouch filled with gold coins, and slammed it into the lawyer's chest. "There is the exact amount of her back wages, multiplied by 10, paid out of my own damn pocket," Garrett barked, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, lethal light. "Her debts are settled, her ties to your corrupt company are severed, and if I ever see your faces on my land again, you won't need lawyers, you'll need undertakers." The two men turned pale, scrambling back into their buggy and tearing down the road as fast as their horses could gallop. Garrett turned around, walking back into the house, and found Emma standing in the hallway, her face wet with quiet tears. He didn't say a word about her crying. He simply walked up to her, took her large, trembling hands in his own, and led her into the grand parlor. Waiting in the parlor were 3 elegant French tailors, surrounded by bolts of the most expensive, rich fabrics Emma had ever seen. "Mr. Vance," the head tailor stammered, looking nervously at Emma's full, voluptuous figure. We usually design for the petite ladies of the city. This layout will require much more fabric, and perhaps a corset to trim the—" "No corsets," Garrett interrupted fiercely, his voice vibrating with absolute authority as he looked at Emma's breathtaking curves. "You will not hide an inch of her, and you will not change her shape to fit your narrow city ideas." He walked over to a bolt of deep midnight blue velvet, running his rough fingers over the soft, luxurious material. "Use this," Garrett commanded, looking directly into Emma's eyes with a heat that made her entire body tingle. "Cut it wide, cut it proud, and make sure it flatters every beautiful curve she has." The tailors immediately went to work, draping the rich velvet over Emma's broad shoulders and wrapping it around her thick waist. For the first time in her entire life, as she looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, Emma didn't feel heavy or clumsy. The velvet hugged her full hips and accentuated her soft, lush bust, making her look like a goddess of the western frontier. Garrett stood behind her, his large hands coming to rest gently on her velvet-covered waist, his gaze in the mirror completely devoted. "Look at yourself, Emma," he whispered into her hair, his touch sending a wave of electric warmth through her core. "You are absolute perfection. And it's time this whole territory learned to look at you the way I do." The news of Emma's presence at the Vance Ranch spread through the territory like a wildfire on a dry prairie. 2 weeks after the disaster, the annual Autumn Social was held in the town square, a grand gathering for all the wealthy ranchers and town elite. Emma walked into the bustling town hall at Garrett's side, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was wearing the custom midnight blue velvet gown, the rich fabric draped beautifully over her full hips and accentuating her lush, soft curves. The moment they stepped through the heavy oak doors, the music seemed to falter, and a heavy, suffocating silence washed over the room. A group of high society women, led by the mayor's haughty wife, Evelyn, immediately clustered together, their eyes darting to Emma with sharp, venomous glares. "Look at her," Evelyn whispered loudly to her companions, her fan fluttering furiously. "A common maid parading around in velvet, thinking she can hide that massive, clumsy frame under expensive fabric. She looks like a draft horse trying to play dress-up," another woman sneered, her cruel laughter cutting through the room like a knife. Emma felt the blood rush to her face, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt as the old, familiar urge to run away and hide threatened to overwhelm her. Garrett felt her stiffen, and his jaw tightened into a hard, dangerous line as he scanned the room, his eyes dark with an icy, lethal fury. Before he could speak, the mayor stepped forward, flanked by two burly town deputies, looking to humiliate Emma publicly to please his wealthy voters. "Vance, we respect your wealth, but this social is for the respectable citizens of this town," the mayor said arrogantly, pointing a finger toward Emma.
"We don't allow fraudulent servants who manipulate tragedy for profit to sit at the same tables as our wives." Evelyn stepped up beside her husband, her face twisted in a smug, triumphant grin. "You belong in the kitchen, girl, not pretending to be a lady in a room full of your betters." The crowd murmured in agreement, expecting the large, quiet maid to burst into tears and flee the hall in deep disgrace. Instead, Garrett moved with the terrifying speed of a striking rattlesnake, stepping between the mayor and Emma. His large, calloused hand shot out, gripping the mayor's expensive silk tie and yanking the man forward until their faces were mere inches apart. The two deputies reached for their sidearms, but Garrett's hand instantly dropped to the pearl handle of his Colt revolver, his thumb drawing the hammer back with a sharp, echoing click. "Touch those irons, and you'll be dead before they clear the leather," Garrett growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that made the deputies freeze instantly. The entire hall went completely dead silent, the guests holding their breath in absolute paralyzed terror. Garrett looked down at the trembling mayor, his dark eyes burning with a lawless frontier justice that no city title could ever protect against. "Every single person in this room breathes because of the woman you just insulted," Garrett said, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "If any man, woman, or child in this territory ever speaks a disrespectful word about Emma again, I will personally burn this town to the ground and buy the ashes." He shoved the mayor backward into the crowd, then turned back to Emma, his expression instantly softening into pure, unadulterated devotion. He offered his strong arm to her, ignoring the stunned, trembling crowd as if they were nothing but dust beneath his boots. "Let's go home, my queen," Garrett whispered softly, his eyes locking onto hers with a warmth that completely healed every scar the town had ever left on her heart. The grand iron gates of the Vance ranch closed behind them, shutting out the cruel, whispering world forever. Garrett led Emma up the wide marble steps of the veranda, the midnight blue velvet of her dress rustling softly against the polished wood. The very next evening, the estate was transformed into a paradise of glowing lanterns, sweet-smelling pine, and a feast that could feed an army. Garrett had personally sent out a decree to every corner of the territory, a mandatory gala, not for the high society snobs, but for the hard-working folks, the ranch hands, and anyone who knew the true value of honor. When Emma walked down the grand staircase, she took everyone's breath away. She wore a breathtaking new gown of deep crimson velvet, tailored perfectly to embrace her magnificent, full-figured silhouette, highlighting the rich, soft curves that Garrett so deeply adored. The crowd of rough cowboys and honest frontiersmen erupted into a roaring cheer, their hats lifted high in genuine, roaring respect for the woman who had conquered the river. Garrett stepped to the center of the grand hall, his powerful arm sliding firmly around Emma's thick, beautiful waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "Listen to me, every soul from here to the border," Garrett's voice boomed, filled with an absolute, unbreakable pride. "This is Emma Hayes, the bravest soul on the frontier, the savior of my blood, and as of this moment, she is my wife and the true queen of the Vance Empire." Emma looked into his fierce, devoted eyes, realizing that her heavy steps hadn't tilted a ship. They had walked her straight into the heart of a man who loved every single inch of her. "Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Garrett handled the corrupt town officials the right way, or should he have taken his revenge even further? Let me know in the comments below.